Kia ora tātou katoa, talofa lava, and warm Pacific greetings to one and all. It's a weird sort of situation where I can only see two people, and I prefer looking at the whites of people's eyes as we're talking here. But look, I do want to acknowledge this distinguished speakers throughout your program, and in particular the membership of PASAI, and of course the New Zealand Office of the Auditor General, the Tumuaki o te Manaro Take. I'm also particularly delighted that New Zealand is hosting your Congress. And in many ways, I'm glad, because that reflects very strongly the value that we place on the relationship that the New Zealand Office of Auditor General has in its long-standing association with PASAI and with members of the Pacific region, which I'd say is very, very dear to my heart. I'm glad also, just talking to the officials here, that New Zealand supports the PASAI's strategic priorities, particularly in building the audit capabilities, but also improving standards right throughout the Pacific region. I thought maybe just listening to the speaker earlier, I thought I'd share with you some experiences in how the Office of Auditor General here in New Zealand has helped me as a backbencher in opposition, but also more recently my experience as a minister reporting to select committees in Parliament for our annual estimates hearings. As a opposition member, before grilling government members, one of the things valued and continue to value is the briefing by the Office of the Auditor General. And that briefing gives many of us MPs an insight into the running of that organisation, the kinds of systems that they have in place. The Auditor General will also remark on whether it's a qualified or unqualified opinion that they have, and will itemize a number of areas where the Auditor General believes that the ministry has to work on. And then it also provides a number of questions that MPs can use on ministers. We always found that quite valuable, to use those questions to ask the ministers, what are they doing with the money? What are they doing with their strategic activities that they've secured the money from? This time around, as a minister, I report to the Justice Select Committee as the Minister of Courts, and I report also to the Social Services Committee as the Minister for Pacific Peoples. Well, I'm allocated at a time. Before coming in, the Auditor General is providing a similar briefing to the members of that Select Committee, which I'm not privy to, and that helps them prepare also for questions to myself. I suppose the point I'm wanting to use that narrative for is really to emphasize the crucial role that the Office of Auditor Generals play, not only here, but I suspect throughout the Pacific region. Because I think in this day and age, as countries grow and develop and get a good sense of who they are and a good sense of who they are in the global world, the role of Officer General, its independency, is critical in helping make sure that our democracies, however small they may be, are open and transparent. And one of the ways that the Office of Auditor General does that, in my view, is making sure that you're supporting members of the opposition to do their role, the government accountable. And that's an important part of becoming an effective leader in our democracy. And the Office of Auditor General, in my view, is a very vital institution of democracy. And so the role that I see all of our officers throughout the Pacific region is a strong leadership role to ensure that our governments are open, transparent, that we are using public resources in the best way possible, and that there is accountability. But it's also about making sure that there is long-term resilience for all of our nations in the Pacific region. It's a very, I want to say that from a New Zealand perspective, as a Minister of Pacific Heritage, I look to the Pacific and recognize that it's in our best interest for New Zealand to make sure that every nation in the Pacific is strong, resilient, and that these democratic institutions are supported and play a very critical role here. I'm not saying that we are by any means perfect. What I am saying is, over years of experience in New Zealand, many of the nations regard us and the systems and the way that we do things at a very high par. And so I think we've got experiences that we can share with the rest of the region. In terms of the challenges that we currently face with the unprecedented pandemic confronting all of us in the region, it's actually, we're challenged in the way that we can no longer do things as we've always been accustomed. And one of the things that the COVID-19 has forced us in the region is to begin to focus more locally in our region. I think the old adage of think globally and act locally, I think the act locally now becomes really, really important, because the resources that is required to help our small island nations cannot be secured internally. And it's a matter of us partnering with small island nations, not just with New Zealand, but including all other external partners, those who have money, because again, it's in our best interest to make sure that the Pacific are supported in this economic recovery. In my discussions with a number of ministers around the region, what comes through is the view about sovereignty, food sovereignty, is the view about having greater control over the economics of their countries. And more recently, our experience with the Cook Islands has been, the Cook Islands have become so dependent on tourism that if we didn't work in partnership with them to make sure that we could roll out the vaccine as quickly as possible with them, they were already making predictions about the severity of the economic downturn that they would experience. And we were already seeing a number of peoples on the islands leaving the islands and coming to New Zealand. The good thing is the Pacific Island nations are determined to make sure that they're protecting their peoples first and foremost. That's the one thing that I have appreciated, the leadership around the region, to protect people first and foremost in their livelihoods. And it follows also that for New Zealand, that's been our focus. The best economic response is a strong health response. And thus we've been placing quite a lot of emphasis in keeping our people safe throughout. Nonetheless, we realize that for small island nations, the economic downturn is significantly more impactful than for some of the bigger nations. And we are doing all that we can to make sure that we're not only providing direct resources to those islands, but we're working in partnership with stakeholders like Australia and other like-minded countries to make sure that the support is there. Direct budget control, budget support. As a nation, we always believe that we would grant money rather than borrowing or lending monies to our small island nations. And when that happens, when significant resources are poured into small island nations, it actually means that your role as the Office of Auditor Generals, as members of PASAI, actually becomes even more important than ever before. Because what's required here is that we not only have to act quickly, be able to utilize the public expenditure from our friends and neighbors, but in a way where we are accountable and building confidence, not only with your local population, but the populations of the donor countries. And in many ways, it's making sure that we can build the public trust and help maintain that social contract that were between states and citizens. But just because there is a need for us to act quickly does not mean that we then are able to take shortcuts and not ensure that our National Auditor Office are accountable and to make sure that we're maintaining that public trust between us and the Pacific. So I suppose, again, I can't help but feel that in times of stress, as we are all experiencing, it's strong, good leadership that's required to stay on course, to steady the role for the years ahead. Finally, you made mention about more recent developments in Aotearoa in terms of the dawn raids that our government here has agreed that a formal apology be delivered this Saturday on the 26th. It's not lost on me that whilst it impacted on Pacific peoples of Aotearoa, predominantly Samoan, Tongan, but it also affected peoples of Polynesia, those who are no longer with us, but also those who returned to the islands and did not ever return again. This is an issue about racism and discrimination. It's an issue that existed in the 1970s and still continues to challenge us. And what we are doing as a government is be able to deliver an apology that is meaningful, but I'm also infusing our cultural lens as a Minister of Pacific Heritage and my ministerial colleagues of Māori Heritage, infusing a cultural lens to recognize that we all have a role to play in lifting the better well-being outcomes for all of our countries, whether it's here in Aotearoa or in the Pacific regions. And for us as a government of Aotearoa New Zealand, one of the new things that you'll see from us is greater emphasis on our cultural lens to establish guiding principles that recognize that New Zealand recognizes our strong people-to-people relationship, which we refer to in the Indigenous language as whanaungatanga, our strong collective aspiration to do the right thing for all peoples, and our strong view that we are only passing through this for a time, and we have to leave a country in a far better state for the next generation coming through, or the principle of manaakitanga, that we are stewards for a time, and we've got to leave things in a far better place for others. So I hope I'll finish off there and just hope that some of those comments might be useful to you. I emphasize again how crucial the roles of the Office of Auditor Generals are, not only for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also for all of our nations throughout, because I think you have a key role to play for open, transparent, and strong, effective governments and maintaining the trust between our populations, who we should also be encouraging to play a very crucial role in our democracies and growing all of that. Anyway, from me, all the best throughout the remainder of your Congress. I'm hopeful that after we roll out the vaccine all of this year, that we can meet face to face next time you have your Congress. Soifua, manuia kia kaha.